Welcome in, everyone. This is Sean with MTG 808 Jr., and today we're going to continue coverage of our Youth Two-Headed Giant Standard Pauper Tournament, which we ran this past Sunday, which was September 17th. Once again, we had 8 players, or 4 teams of Two-Headed Giants, competing in our tournament, and our previous video we covered Luke and Isaiah, who won the tournament. They put in a ton of effort and came up with a really good strategy, and their hard work paid off, and they came in first place of the tournament. So check out our video on that if you want to learn about their mono red spells deck or their blue green ramp deck. But today we're going to be focusing on Joseph and Naya, who came in second place, and we'll feature their blue-black cycling deck today, as well as their red-green energy deck. So once again, just before we begin, standard Pauper. So it's all the standard legal sets, but only commons are legal, or cards that have been printed at common previously. So it's a really fun format. It's very accessible. All of our youth tournaments have been standard Pauper so far, and it's been a really fun project trying to encourage clubs to form and helping provide them cards to encourage them to come to our tournament. So it's been a ton of fun for me to have this project, and the kids have been having a really good time getting to build their standard Pauper decks and come and compete in our tournaments. So let's get started here. So Joe and Naya. Joe is a senior at Nanakuli High and Intermediate School. He's been playing in our tournaments since the beginning, so we started last January, and I think he's been playing Magic for probably a little over a year now. Naya is an 8th grader at Kavaihona Public Charter School, and he has been playing Magic for a long time. He plays other card games like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Hearthstone. I've heard him talk about all sorts of different games, so Magic is one of the many games that Naya enjoys. But he's been coming to our tournament since last February. He's played in a couple of West Side Comics standard Pauper FNMs, so he's competed against the adults with this standard Pauper format, and he's just been having a blast. Big smile on his face when he comes to tournaments, and he's a joy to have there. So Joe and Naya, they weren't planning on being partners when they showed up to this tournament. Joe had tentative plans with a partner but didn't secure their contact information, and Naya, his partner, or his friend who he wanted to partner with, just couldn't make it to the tournament. So they both kind of showed up without a partner, hoping that they could find someone to play with, and it worked out really nicely that they could pair together. I know that Naya has had a ton of respect for Joe, because Joe just dominated. He was one of the 2 players that dominated the first 3 tournaments that we had. Joe came in second place twice and first place once in the first 3 tournaments that we had. So for a long time, Naya was like, Joe's the guy I gotta beat. He's one of the best players. My goal is to beat Joe. That was Naya's outlook for a long time. And Naya has had some success as well. In our final tournament of last school year, was Two-Headed Giant, and Naya came in the finals along with his partner Kahi. So Naya has some respectable finishes under his belt, and he's got the drive and the understanding to play the game. So both of these players, they've put their time in, they understand the game, and it has paid off for them here with a second place finish. Even though their decks were built independently of each other, they didn't have a chance to plan ahead of time how they wanted to build their strategy. But they both showed up with a very solid deck, and they had a very solid finish as a result. So side note, their team name was Love Nissa, because they both just so happen to have Nissa deck boxes, and Naya is playing the card Attune with Aether, which features Nissa on her face. And then, cool side story, in the prize packs that they got, Naya opened up a foil Nissa, the blue-green Planeswalker. So he was just super stoked. Their Nissa fandom really paid off for Naya. So congratulations once again. So here we have our blue-black cycling deck played by Joe. It's called a blue-black cycling deck because it's kind of built around this mechanic called cycling. And cycling basically says you can either cast the spell as normal, right, for the cost in the upper right hand corner to get the effect that it says on the card, or you can pay the cycle cost, which in this case is 2, to discard it and draw a new card, right? So the cycle cards all give you a bunch of options where you can either cast them for what they are, or you can cash it in for a new card if you pay the cycle cost. Um, so cycling is kind of one of those slower mechanics because you have to spend time and mana to pay the cycling cost, but it's very powerful in that it gives you lots of options all the time. Magic is a game of options. The more options you have access to, the more options you can see, the more likely it is that you're going to come up with a winning strategy. So this is a very powerful archetype for that reason. Joe really likes playing slow blue decks that are just going to win a long game, and he really built this deck with that in mind. Wandering Death is one of these cards that's great in the long game. You get to return 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand, so you're trading 1 card for 2 very powerful cards. But the trade-off is that this card is not good in the early game, because if you don't have 2 creatures in your graveyard, the card does nothing. Or you can pay 2 mana to cycle it, right? So it's a slow card, but it's very powerful, especially once you get to the late game. So Wandering Death here, a great example to just show you what his deck is trying to do. So there's a bunch of cards with cycling, like Hieroglyphic Illumination is another one. A lot of his creatures cycle. Wasteland Scorpion has cycling. Horror of the Broken Lands has cycling. Shimmer Scale Drake has cycling. Striped River Winder has cycling. Right, so lots of cards in his deck have cycle. Even his lands. He's playing 8 of these desert cycle lands. So he's got a ton of cycle cards in the deck, which means he's gonna have options. A slow game is gonna favor this deck. But there's also what we're gonna call cycle payoffs cards. There's cards in his deck that say if you cycle a card, then you get an effect. Something will happen. So this card, Horror of the Broken Lands, not only does it have cycling, but if you choose not to cycle it and you play it instead, it says whenever you cycle or discard another card, Horror of the Broken Lands gets +2/+1 until end of turn. So it starts out as a 4/4. If you cycle 1 card, it'll become a 6/5 until end of turn. If you cycle a second card, it'll become an 8/6 until end of turn, and it can just keep growing and growing, depending on how many cycle cards that you're able to cycle that turn. So Horror of the Broken Lands is one of the more powerful payoff cards in the deck, and it itself has cycling, so it's just a very good flexible card. The next cycle payoff card here is Pitiless Vizier, which is a 4 mana 4/2. Not the best stats for a 4 mana creature, but it has a very powerful ability, and it says whenever you cycle or discard a card, Pitiless Vizier gains indestructible until end of turn, which means that damage won't kill it. Combat damage, burn spell damage, any sort of damage will not kill an indestructible creature. So Pitiless Vizier only has 2 toughness, but if it gets into a fight and it's got a cycle card to back it up, it's gonna live. It'll often win because 4 power will usually take down the average creature, right? It'll take down almost all the 3 drops, most of the 4 drops, all of the 2 drops, right? As long as it's backed up by a cycle card. So very powerful payoff card. Not the greatest card if you don't have the ability to cycle, but in a late game where you have access to lots of mana, you have access to lots of cards, this card is great. The last cycle card here is Hecamme Sentinels. It's a 3 mana 2/3. Says whenever you cycle or discard a card, Hecamme Sentinels gets +1/+1 until end of turn, right? Average sized creature. If it was just a 3 mana 2/3, it wouldn't be that good, but since it can grow and the deck has a ton of cycling cards in it, this is a very, very solid card. It'll often grow to be able to get into combat with 4 drops, maybe even 5 drops if you have enough cycle cards. So very, very powerful cards that are trying to get to the late game. My criticism here of Joe's deck is that it's very, very focused on getting into the late game. He's got 4 7 mana creatures right here, like very powerful creature. 7 mana is a whole lot of mana. He's got 7 5 mana creatures here, right? And that's not bad. You can play a ton of expensive creatures, especially when they have cycling, because it's like, well, if you don't think you're going to get to 7 mana anytime soon, you can cycle the card and see if you can get something cheaper, right? Same thing with these 5 drops, right? If you're having trouble hitting your land drops, you can cycle them, make sure that you're able to play your lands to cast your other spells. Um, so having a lot of high drops isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing if you want to win the late game. But in the early game, if you have too many expensive cards stuck in your hand, even if they have cycling, it means that you're spending your mana um, trying to cycle through your deck instead of stopping your opponent, right? So the deck that Joe and Naya lost to was the mono red spells deck paired with the ramp deck, and the spells deck really did all of the work in the match that they played. It just got ahead early, and then eventually the burn spells and the triggered abilities from Firebrand Archer and Thermal Alchemist were just able to take them down. So, um, if there was a point in the game where if Joe drew exactly Cartouche of Ambition, they would have been able to take over the game. Cartouche of Ambition is one of the more powerful cards in the deck, right? He's got a lot of expensive, powerful creatures. If he can give one of them lifelink, then he'll be able to come back from a really slow start. So there was a point in the match where it was winnable for Joe and Naya, especially if Joe drew Cartouche of Ambition, but he did not, and they just kind of got run over, right? It was a very quick match. It was a good match. They put up a good fight. There was a chance for them to win, but in the end, they just succumbed to the pressure. And I think one of the reasons, or one thing that you might want to consider if you pick this deck up moving forward, would be adding more cheap spells to it. Unquenchable Thirst is a very powerful one. Joe is only playing 2. I would recommend playing 4 just because it's one of the more powerful cheap spells that you can have to slow your opponent down. Joe really likes Essence Scatter. He likes countering people's spells. It feels really good to counter their spell, but it feels equally bad to draw an Essence Scatter when they've got stuff in play already and it's attacking you and you're on your back foot. So Essence Scatter, very good when you have a slight advantage. Very, very bad when you're on your back foot, which is where this deck ends up a lot. So, Essence Scatter is good on turn 2. So is Unquenchable Thirst. There's also a number of cheap creatures that this archetype can play. One of them, or as you may notice, Joe is not playing any 2-drop creatures, right? So that means he can't start blocking until turn 3 at the earliest. He's got some good blockers, but being a turn behind a really aggressive deck like Mono Red is rough. So one option that Joe's deck has here is Seeker of Insight. It's a 2-mana 1/3. It blocks some of the 2-drops in the format, not all of them, and it'll live. It will trade with some of the other good 3-drops in the format, or I'm sorry, other 2-drops in the format. So it's got a decent body, especially for playing defense, but it's got a very relevant ability, right? Tap, draw a card, then discard a card. We call that ability looting in Magic, right? Like you're going through the rubble and finding something of value and taking it with you, and you leave something behind. So we call that looting in Magic. And so this card, the key word here is discard a card. So by discarding a card to Seeker of Insight, you're not cycling a card, but you're still going to trigger all your cycle payoffs, because they say whenever you cycle or discard another card, right? So when you activate Seeker of Insight, you're going to trigger your Horror of the Broken Lands or your Pitiless Vizier. So this is a very powerful option. However, you can only do it if you've cast a non-creature spell this turn. So Joe has 16 non-creature spells in his deck. Is that enough to play Seeker of Insight? Maybe not, but it is a very good option to consider for this archetype. You might want to change some other things around in the deck if you're going to try this guy out, though. The other option, which is, it doesn't have a powerful effect like Seeker of Insight, but it does much better in combat, is a Cunning Survivor, 2-mana 1/3, same size, but this guy can grow when you cycle or discard a card. It'll get +1/+0 until end of turn, and it can't be blocked. The can't be blocked part is, it doesn't come up that often because the rest of the deck is trying to win through card advantage, not by pushing through damage at key points. But being able to grow its power means that it'll trade in combat more often. It's not exactly what the deck is trying to do in terms of playing to the board and trying to get in damage, but it is it's a powerful way to interact on turn 2, which is what I think the deck might be looking for. So this is another option for the blue-black deck. But all in all, I think the blue-black deck is going to be one of the mainstay archetypes in the format moving forward. It was very good, or when it came together, it was very good in Amonkhet Limited, which and almost all the same cards here are legal in Standard Pauper. So keep your eye on this archetype. This is a good start if you want to just pick this up and play. And then those suggestions that I made about adding more 2-drops, you can keep that in mind if you find yourself playing against very fast decks. Moving on here, Naya's deck, he's playing red-green energy, and he's been playing this deck since he started playing Magic, or at least since he's started coming to our tournaments, he's been playing this deck. I think every tournament he's played in, he's played this deck, or this archetype at least. And the backbone of this deck is basically the mechanic called Energy. So there's some cards in the deck that say, when you play them, do something and get some energy, right? Attune with Aether, 1 green, search your deck for a basic land, and get 2 energy. Put that land into your hand and get 2 energy, right? So the energy is just a resource that you can use, and there's some very powerful cards, or there's some good cards in this deck that become very powerful if you have energy to dump into them. Aether Chaser is one of the best 2-drops in the format. I talked about this in the Red Deck Wins video, but in this archetype, it's even more powerful because you have energy to put into it, right? You can use its energy for other things. So this is a 2-mana, 2/1 first strike. It's going to win in combat a lot of the time against many other 2-drops, and when you attack with it, you can pay 2 energy to make a servo. It makes 2 energy when it comes into play, or if you cast Attune with Aether on turn 1, then you're going to have 2 energy left over. You can put it into this, right? Get a bunch of extra 1/1 servo tokens. Aetherstream Leopard and Thriving Rhino, both of these allow you to pay energy when it attacks for it to grow. Aetherstream Leopard grows temporarily. Thriving Rhino gets counters that let it grow over time. And then Riparian Tiger says it gets +2/+2, which is, it becomes a 6/6 trample, which is very powerful for a 5-drop. So these energy payoffs that allow you to spend energy when you're attacking make these creatures above average when they're attacking, right? There's also a couple exert creatures in this deck, which is also a mechanic that rewards you for attacking. So Nefcrop Entangler, 2-mana, 2/1 trample. You may exert it as it attacks. If you do, it gets +1/+2 until end of turn, but it doesn't untap on your next turn, right? It's an ability that gives you a choice when you attack with it. Same thing with the energy payoffs, right? Sometimes it might be better to attack with your 2/1. Sometimes it might be better to attack with a 3/3 and then not have a creature to attack with next turn. So it gives you options. Same thing with Emberhorn Minotaur. 5/4 Menace is very powerful. Sometimes you just want a 4/3 though, so you have your options. So this deck is full of creatures with exert or with energy payoffs that reward you for attacking, right? When they're attacking, they are above average. However, when they're blocking, they are slightly below average, right? Aether Chaser is a 2/1 with first strike. That's an okay blocker. It's not going to block 3-drops very well. It's not going to block 4-drops very well. Nefcrop Entangler, 2/1 as well. Aetherstream Leopard, without its ability, it and Thriving Rhino are both 2/3s, right? They have to attack in order to get their bonus. Riparian Tiger as a 4/4 on defense for 5 mana. That's solid, but it's not outstanding. So this deck, very good when it's attacking, not as great when it's defending. So Naya has some interesting card choices that allow him to kind of make sure that he's the one attacking. One of them is Bloodlust Insider here. 1 mana, 1/1. You can tap it to give a creature haste until end of turn, right? So if you're on the draw, you're still going to be the first one to attack with all your creatures if you play this guy on turn 1. It's a very powerful effect. I don't think you want too many because, you don't want multiple Bloodlust Insiders. Drawing them late in the game is not that great. But it is a very powerful effect that plays to the deck's strength of wanting to attack. Same thing with Cartouche of Zeal, giving his creatures haste. The other way that Naya can gain tempo is with Magma Spray and Shock, right? As I in my last video, I called Shock probably the best red spell in the format. it just does everything. 1 mana, 2 damage to target creature or player, right? You can finish off your opponent if they're at 2, or you can spend 1 mana to trade this card with their 2-drop, right? You spent 1 mana on your answer, they spent 2 mana on their threat, you ended up um, positive on that trade in terms of tempo. So Shock is very powerful. It allows you to keep your opponent from pressing too much of an advantage early, which then creates the space for this deck to start pushing the advantage, right? You want to be attacking with these red-green creatures. So this is a very powerful archetype. One of the interesting things when it comes to deck building with this deck is your 3-drop slot, right? You have the option of Renegade Freighter, very good when it's attacking. It's okay but underwhelming when it's defending. Same thing with Aether Stream Leopard and Thriving Rhino. As far as which one you want to prioritize, Naya is playing 4 Rhino, 2 Leopard, and 1 Renegade Freighter. I don't know if that's the correct combination. I think Renegade Freighter is very powerful. It's one of the more powerful cards in the format, but it might be right to just stick to your energy synergies as much as possible. So, that's something that you can play around with if you decide to pick up this deck. But otherwise, I think that this is a very solid list. Naya has played this deck for a long time. He's played it against a lot of different people. He's put the time in to find a good list, and this is it right here. This is a very good list. So I'd recommend you start here if you're interested in this archetype. Blue-black cycling, also a great archetype that you can check out if you are interested in. And let me know what you think about Standard Pauper. If you're on the island of Oahu, check out Westside Games. They run Standard Pauper about once a month for FNM, so check them out there. Or if you are a youth on the island and you want to play Standard Pauper, you can get in touch with me through Facebook. You can leave a comment on this video. We've got a growing youth scene here. Would love for as many people as possible to be a part of it. So thanks for stopping by. Let me know what you think, and I will catch you later. Peace.